Picture the unrelenting, deafening roar of a heavy stamping press. You are standing right in the middle of a factory floor in the summer of 1943.
Oh, and the air in those places, it's thick with the smell of ozone, hot metal, and, well, the sweat of tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, exactly. Working shoulder to shoulder in just sweltering heat. The physical noise alone is overwhelming, but the psychological pressure is even worse.
Way worse, because you're stepping into a literal pressure cooker.
Right. This isn't the glossy, triumphant wartime newsreel you've, seen 100 times. You are about to step into the dark underside of that boom.
Yeah, the United States is desperately mobilizing for a global war, and in the process, dragging millions of citizens out of the rural South and cramming them into these industrial boomtowns.
Which means the demand for labor is infinite, right? But the physical space is basically non-existent.
Exactly. And you have an old, deeply entrenched racial caste system being forced to share the same stifling air as a sudden, desperate federal mandate for equality.
It's a recipe for disaster. So our mission today in this deep dive is to explore a dossier of historical sources detailing how this massive wartime migration just boiled over.
Right, because the structural integrity of the American home front was really buckling under that exact strain.
And we're looking at 4 distinct flashpoints: Mobile, Beaumont, Detroit, and Harlem. Plus, little callback to Los Angeles.
Yeah. The overarching theme you'll hear in all these sources is that the old racial order was under unprecedented strain.
Think of it like an overfilled steam engine. The government is, shoveling coal into the furnace as fast as humanly possible.
Demanding more ships, more planes, more munitions.
Exactly. The steam is building. Millions of workers are pouring into cities that have no infrastructure to hold them. Imagine you're trying to pour a gallon of water into a pint glass.
Right.
But at the exact same time, someone else is desperately trying to force a lid onto it. Eventually, the glass shatters. You just can't violently compress a changing society while bolting the lid shut.
And when that engine shattered in 1943, the shrapnel hit very specific targets. That same racial order dictated, again and again, who did the killing and who did the dying.
So to understand the explosions, we have to examine the raw materials that built this pressure cooker, starting before that first explosion in May.
Right. By the time we hit the spring of 1943, the U.S. was experiencing a total demographic earthquake.
Because the Great Migration had been happening for decades, but the war effort it hit the fast-forward button.
Oh, absolutely. You had millions of Americans, largely from the agrarian South, packing whatever they could carry and flooding into these industrial centers.
The numbers are staggering. Cities like Detroit and Mobile saw their populations swell by hundreds of thousands in, a matter of months.
Yeah, and they were walking into cities that were completely unprepared to house them.
The sources document a profound infrastructural collapse, don't they?
They really do. I mean, we aren't just talking about a tight real estate market here. We're talking about families living in tents. Or, converted chicken coops, living in their cars.
Just whatever shelter they could find. And the housing that did exist was rigidly segregated.
Right, which is crucial. The segregation wasn't just like an unwritten custom. It was enforced by restrictive covenants, redlining, and
the literal physical threat of violence.
Exactly. So African-American migrants moving north or west to escape Jim Crow found themselves restricted to a few tiny, heavily circumscribed neighborhoods.
They couldn't expand into the new suburban defense housing being thrown up for white workers.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So the geographical boundaries of these neighborhoods acted as these unyielding physical walls.
So as the population doubled and tripled, the walls didn't move. I mean, the density must have become absolutely suffocating.
Suffocating is the right word, and that density bred a very specific kind of psychological exhaustion.
There's a practice mentioned in the sources, hot bedding.
Ooh, hot bedding. Yeah, because the factories were running 24 hours a day on 3 different shifts. The boarding houses operated the exact same way.
Wait, really? So you're saying?
Yeah, a worker would finish a grueling 8-hour shift, walk back to a cramped room, and climb into a bed that was still physically warm from the worker who had just vacated it.
Gross. Just sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, zero privacy.
All layered on top of intense anxiety about the war.
Mm-hmm.
And worrying about loved ones overseas.
But the crucial friction point wasn't just in the boarding houses, was it?
No, because while the neighborhoods remained violently segregated, the workplaces were undergoing this forced radical integration.
Right, because the insatiable demand for labor meant defense contractors couldn't just rely exclusively on the traditional white male workforce anymore.
They simply didn't have the numbers. They had to hire women, and they had to hire black workers.
So the factory floor suddenly becomes this space where black and white workers, many of them recent Southern migrants carrying generations of ingrained racial attitudes, are just thrown into unprecedented proximity.
Right. And the sources make it clear that black workers weren't just passively accepting the lowest paying, most dangerous jobs anymore either.
Because the war offered leverage.
Exactly. You have a massive labor shortage, which means workers suddenly have bargaining power. Black Americans were actively pressing for the skilled jobs and promotions they'd been denied.
And they had a new, highly controversial tool at their disposal, right? The FEPC.
Right, the Fair Employment Practice Committee. This was established by Executive Order 8802.
Which Roosevelt signed under immense pressure, if I remember correctly.
Oh, massive pressure. Civil rights leaders were threatening a massive march on Washington if the defense industries weren't desegregated.
So the order essentially forbade discrimination in defense industries on the basis of race, creed, color, or national origin.
On paper, yes. But the sources also note the FEPC had an annual budget of almost nothing.
Right, a tiny staff, virtually no real enforcement power.
Yeah, it was, in practice, a paper tiger. Just a weak federal nudge.
So how does a weak nudge generate such massive, violent pushback?
Yep.
You have a country fighting a war for freedom abroad, utilizing every ounce of domestic labor they can find. But locally, people are fighting tooth and nail to keep their fellow workers disenfranchised. How could the government expect this not to explode?
Well, they probably should have expected it.
Yeah.
Because the FEPC didn't need a massive enforcement arm to be perceived as an existential threat.
Right, it's the symbol of it.
Exactly. It established the precedent that the federal government was no longer unconditionally backing the racial caste system.
Ah, I see.
For white workers who viewed skilled labor not just as a paycheck, but as a marker of their social supremacy. The mere existence of the FEPC signaled the ground was shifting beneath their feet.
The paradox here is glaring. You're demanding radical industrial change while aggressively resisting any social change. It's the exact blueprint for a disaster.
The variables were perfectly aligned. Overcrowded housing, forced proximity, intense economic competition.
And a terrified establishment clinging to the status quo.
Right. The boomtowns were primed. They only required a localized spark.
And that spark arrived in May of 1943. So let's move from the abstract pressures down to the sweltering dirt and steel of the mobile shipyards.
Right. The Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company, known as ADSCO.
ADSCO was a behemoth, wasn't it? Absolutely central to the war effort in the South.
Oh, yeah. They were churning out the Liberty ships that were keeping the Allied supply lines alive.
And on May 24th, the friction we just outlined materialized into a specific tangible action. The FEPC pressed ADSCO management to upgrade 12 black workers to the position of welder.
12. Out of a workforce of tens of thousands, we are talking about a dozen men.
Just 12 guys. But welding isn't just any job on a shipyard, is it?
No, it's highly skilled labor. It requires training, precision, and it pays significantly more than sweeping or hauling scrap metal.
And more importantly, in the unwritten caste system of the 1940s shipyard, the welder's mask and the torch were symbols of status.
Exactly. They belonged exclusively to white men.
So placing black men on previously all-white welding crews crossed a rigid psychological boundary.
It demonstrated, in undeniable physical terms, that black workers were equally capable of performing high-status, skilled labor.
And if they were capable of equal labor, the entire justification for treating them as a subordinate class collapses.
Completely. And the reaction to those 12 promotions is one of the most chilling data points in these sources.
Because the shipyard didn't just see a walkout, roughly 4,000 white workers erupted into a rampage.
Right. They grabbed whatever heavy shipyard tools they could find, pipes, wrenches, clubs, and they began physically hunting black workers across the docks.
That is horrifying. And they
Yeah.
didn't isolate their attack to just the 12 newly promoted welders, did they?
No, it was indiscriminate. They targeted any black worker in the vicinity. The mob effectively drove the entire black workforce completely out of the shipyard.
Which halted massive sections of wartime production. The sheer disproportion of that reaction reveals the fragility of the system.
It really does. Because if a social hierarchy is truly robust, it doesn't require a violent mob of 4,000 people to defend it against 12 guys getting a promotion.
Exactly. The violence is a confession of vulnerability.
And the local authorities were just entirely incapable of containing it. The situation deteriorated so rapidly that the National Guard had to be mobilized.
Just to physically secure the shipyard and restore order. Look at the sheer, stunning irony of this moment.
Yeah.
We're talking about building Liberty ships. The government says, we need welders. 12 capable guys get the job. And the response is 4,000 people abandoning the war effort to violently chase them out with lead pipes.
The pushback wasn't just anti-equality. It was actively anti-American production.
The sources explicitly classify this event not merely as a riot, but as a hate strike that escalated into violence.
Right, which lays bare the hierarchy of values held by the attackers. Confronted with a choice between supporting the national war effort and maintaining local white supremacy, they violently chose the latter.
It's a stark indicator of what truly held priority in the minds of the dominant caste. But, the 80 Destio riot was terrifying because it was rooted in a very tangible, verifiable change in the workplace.
12 promotions actually happened.
Right, but the pressure cooker wasn't contained by the chain link fences at the shipyards. When the shift whistles blew, all that tension and racial anxiety followed the workers out into the streets.
And as the calendar turned to June, we see the violence mutate. It no longer required a real event like a promotion to spark a riot.
It just required a whisper.
Exactly. June of 1943 is heavily characterized by the contagion of fear and the weaponization of false information.
Which brings us to Beaumont, Texas on June 15th and 16th, another major shipbuilding and refining center.
With demographics shifting identically to Mobile, the housing is just as strained. But the trigger here is entirely different.
There's no FEPC mandate here. There's only a rumor, a false accusation that a black man had raped a white woman.
Right. And throughout American history, that specific accusation has been consistently deployed as the ultimate incendiary device for racial terror.
It's basically a fabricated narrative designed to bypass rational thought and instantly trigger a violent protective hysteria among the white population.
It's like a social algorithm designed to optimize for outrage.
Why do rumors hold so much power in these specific moments? Is it because the population is so new and transient that there's no established community trust to act as a buffer against the lies?
That's exactly it. In a normal, settled community, if a wild rumor starts, you have established networks of trust. A local leader, a skeptical neighbor.
Someone to say, hold on, let's look into this before we burn the town down.
Right. But a boomtown has no buffers. You have tens of thousands of strangers who have just arrived from across the country.
And they're already alienated, stressed, exhausted, and anxious.
Yeah, they have zero established trust.
Yeah.
So when you drop a highly volatile rumor into an environment with no social friction to slow it down, it acts like a match in a gas-filled room.
The rumor just provides a recognizable, actionable target for all of their generalized, simmering anxiety.
And the response in Beaumont was catastrophic. White mobs convulsed the town. They bypassed any pretense of justice and swept directly into the black neighborhoods.
This ransacking businesses, torching homes, subjecting the black community to an absolute reign of terror.
Now, the historical sources present varying data on the exact death toll in Beaumont.
Right. Some contemporary reports cite around 3 fatalities, while others suggest higher numbers.
Yeah, likely conflating the Beaumont violence with the broader chaos erupting across the country that same month.
But honestly, the precise casualty count doesn't alter the documented, undeniable reality of the terror inflicted.
Not at all. The burned-out homes and shattered livelihoods were physical testaments to the destructive power of a single lie.
And we must place Beaumont in the wider, overheated context of June 1943. Because earlier that same month, from June 3rd to the 8th, the Zoot Suit riots had paralyzed Los Angeles.
That's a critical parallel. You had off-duty white servicemen, sailors, and soldiers ostensibly preparing to fight the Axis, roaming the streets of L.A., hunting and brutally beating Mexican-American youth.
Right, stripping them of their distinctive Zoot Suits.
It reveals the pervasive nature of the strain. In California, it's servicemen attacking Mexican-Americans. In Texas, it's shipyard workers burning black neighborhoods.
The specific actors change, but the underlying mechanism is identical. The dominant group utilizing violence to assert control over minority populations during a period of intense demographic upheaval.
Beaumont and Mobile were severe, yes, but the sources reveal they were merely the previews for the apex of the crisis.
Because days after Beaumont burned, the pressures of migration, housing, jobs, and rumor all converged on the beating heart of the American war machine.
Right. The arsenal explodes. We're turning to Detroit, Michigan. June 20th through the 22nd, 1943.
Hold on, before we even look at the spark, we have to make sure we grasp the scale here. The raw numbers are almost difficult to process.
The sources note the city was swollen by an influx of 400,000 Southern migrants.
400,000 new people flooding into one city, both black and white migrants. You can't just build housing for 500,000 people overnight.
No, you really can't.
The infrastructure simply didn't exist. It was a structural failure as much as a social one, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the physical logistics of adding 400,000 bodies to an already dense industrial grid. The infrastructure was wholly incapable of absorbing them.
And we discussed the localized segregation earlier, but Detroit was the ultimate citywide manifestation of that structural failure.
Right. African-American migrants were largely confined to a neighborhood known as Paradise Valley,
Which was basically a geographical cage that was forced to hold multitudes more than it was designed for.
The physical friction of just existing in Detroit in the summer of 1943 was a constant, exhausting reality.
And then a heat wave struck in late June, which only amplified the misery.
Oh, those hot-pitting tenements would have been unbearable. The factories were ovens.
So the only escape for working-class families was the city's public parks. And that is where the bomb finally detonates.
Not over a federal policy change.
Right.
Not over a horrific accusation. The deadliest riot of the wartime era starts with a localized brawl at Belle Isle Park on a sweltering Sunday evening.
Belle Isle was a massive park situated in the Detroit River, accessed by a single bridge.
Right, so it was one of the few places where the segregated populations unavoidably mixed.
The sheer volume of people seeking relief from the heat created a powder keg. A fistfight broke out between white and black youths.
But, a fistfight on a bridge doesn't organically shut down the arsenal of democracy.
No, it required an accelerant. It required the same weaponized misinformation we saw in Beaumont, but deployed on a massive citywide scale.
Exactly. As the brawl on the bridge was contained by police, the attendees fled back into their respective segregated neighborhoods.
And as they fled, the rumor mill ignited.
False rumors began racing through both the black and white communities simultaneously, and they were perfectly calibrated to incite maximum protective violence.
In the white neighborhoods, the rumor spread rapidly that black men had attacked white women at the park.
Right. And in the black neighborhoods, an equally terrifying rumor circulated that white men had thrown a black woman and her baby off the Belle Isle Bridge into the river.
Both narratives were entirely fabricated, yet both tapped into the deepest, most visceral fears of each community.
They bypassed any critical assessment and demanded immediate retaliatory action.
The misinformation acted as a multiplier, transforming a localized park skirmish into citywide carnage.
The violence spilled out of the park and engulfed the streets of Detroit for 3 agonizing days.
The toll detailed in the sources is devastating. 34 people were killed. More than 400 were severely injured.
And there was an estimated $2 million in property damage, a staggering sum in 1943.
But the breakdown of those 34 deaths brings us forcefully back to the core theme of this deep dive.
The racial order dictating who does the killing and who does the dying. Out of the 34 dead, 25 were black.
And the sources emphasize a deeply disturbing detail about those 25 fatalities. We aren't just talking about civilian mobs fighting each other in the streets.
No, we are talking about the actions of the state. A significant number of those black victims were shot by the white police force.
This is a critical distinction. In Detroit, the local police force did not function as a neutral arbiter, attempting to restore civil peace.
They acted as an armed extension of the white mob. They were, in many documented instances, a major perpetrator of the violence against the black community.
So the state apparatus wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to, enforcing the racial hierarchy through lethal force.
Right. When the pressure cooker explodes, the institutions of power instinctively protect the dominant caste.
And the ferocity of the violence completely overwhelmed the local authorities anyway, regardless of their allegiances.
The situation escalated into a full-scale urban war zone, eventually requiring federal troops in armored vehicles to occupy the streets of Detroit.
Just to forcibly restore order, consider the strategic impact of this event. The arsenal of democracy, the beating heart of Allied war production, was paralyzed for 3 days.
Factories were shut down or operating with skeleton crews because workers were terrified to leave their homes.
$2 million in infrastructure and property destroyed. Federal troops diverted from the war effort to occupy an American city.
The structural failure of Detroit was a massive self-inflicted wound to the nation's wartime goals.
Detroit became the era's most infamous warning of untended pressures. But as the summer dragged into August, a different kind of explosion happened in New York.
And the documentation is very explicit here. The events in Harlem require a distinctly different analytical framework. We cannot conflate what happened in Harlem with Mobile, Beaumont, or Detroit.
Right. The dates are August 1st and 2nd, 1943. Up to this point, we have been examining violence initiated by the dominant white caste.
White workers attacking black welders in Mobile. White mobs ransacking black neighborhoods in Beaumont. White police and mobs killing black citizens in Detroit.
Harlem was fundamentally, structurally different.
The trigger in Harlem occurs on August 1st, when a white police officer shot and wounded a black soldier named Robert Bandy.
We have to pause and look at the symbolic weight of Robert Bandy. He is a soldier. He is wearing the uniform of the United States military.
He represents the ultimate sacrifice black Americans were being asked to make for their country.
And he is shot by an agent of the state in his own neighborhood. The disrespect and the violence inflicted on a man in uniform was the ultimate insult.
It proved that no amount of patriotism or service could shield a black man from the brutal realities of the racial caste system.
Following the shooting, the familiar accelerant arrives. A rumor rapidly sweeps through Harlem.
But it isn't a rumor of a phantom threat like in Beaumont. It's an exaggeration of a very real event.
The rumor spread that Robert Bandy hadn't just been wounded, but that the police officer had murdered him.
The explosion that followed the rumor's spread was massive. But again, it is imperative to define the nature of this explosion.
This was not a mob hunting down a minority community.
No, this was an uprising. It was a marginalized community striking out. And their anger was directed primarily at the physical symbols of their subjugation.
Specifically, white-owned property and businesses within Harlem. The violence resulted in approximately 6 deaths, hundreds of injuries, and extensive property destruction.
But the official reports, cited in the sources, identify the deep underlying causes. The uprising wasn't solely about the shooting of Robert Bandy.
He was simply the match dropped into a powder keg of long-simmering systemic frustration.
The reports point to relentless discrimination in employment, the denial of basic city services, drastically overcrowded housing, and a long, documented history of police brutality.
So if Detroit and Beaumont were about a dominant group trying to enforce the walls of a cage, Harlem was the people inside the cage finally trying to break the bars.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a completely different mechanism of violence. Detroit and Beaumont were reactionary.
They were policing the perimeter.
Yeah, exactly. But the Harlem uprising was revolutionary in its anger. It was a community striking out against the very conditions that were suffocating them.
The mechanisms, the targets, the underlying psychological motivations, they're all completely different.
The sources frame Harlem in 1943 not as a race riot in the traditional sense, but as a direct structural forerunner to the major urban uprisings of the 1960s.
Because the anger was aimed at exploitative landlords, discriminatory merchants, and a police force that acted as an occupying army rather than a public service.
Right. And when you look at the entirety of 1943, from May to August, the synthesis for anyone studying historical wartime dynamics is profoundly clear.
Which is that the violence of that year was not a series of unfortunate, isolated anomalies. There were dozens of disturbances, riots, and hate strikes across the country.
The undeniable common thread is that cramming a changing, fundamentally unequal society together under massive logistical and psychological pressure leads predictably, almost inevitably, to systemic violence.
And we have to reckon with the cost of that violence. It actively, tangibly undermined the very war effort it was born from.
It halted Liberty ship production at ADDSCO. It devastated the output of the arsenal of democracy in Detroit.
The racism of the home front was a literal drag on the fight against fascism.
And through it all, we see the grim constant of the era. Across all these varied incidents, the overarching racial order decided who did the killing and who did the dying.
We also see the terrifying power of misinformation. The mechanism of the rumor is the connective tissue between Beaumont, Detroit, and Harlem, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. When a population is subjected to extreme stress, overcrowded conditions, and deep social anxiety, their capacity for critical assessment simply evaporates.
False rumors are the psychological spark. The accusation of rape in Beaumont, the horrific tales of violence at Belle Isle, the false report of the soldier's death in Harlem.
Each rumor exploited the existing anxieties of overcrowded, highly stressed populations. They bypassed rational thought by tapping directly into their deepest fears, short-circuiting the brain and leading straight to catastrophic action.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox of the American wartime boom. The Great Migration, the massive industrial mobilization, the very forces that built the bombers and birthed the modern American economy.
They simultaneously constructed the perfect conditions for domestic terror and violence.
The same engines that built the new America were fueling the fires in its streets.
It demands a much more complex, mature reading of American history. The workplace hostilities and the housing riots were the inevitable structural byproduct of a system that desperately demanded black labor, yet violently refused to grant black equality.
You cannot ask a marginalized group to build the arsenal to save democracy abroad while continually denying them the basic tenets of democracy at home and expect the pressure cooker to hold.
You really can't.
It makes you wonder why this specific chapter of the World War II narrative is so thoroughly glossed over in standard history textbooks. We embrace the Rosie the Riveter iconography.
Right.
We love the unifying narrative of rationing, of scrap metal drives, of a country pulling together with rolled-up sleeves. But we collectively ignore the 4,000 workers rioting over a dozen welders.
Or the federal troops rolling through Detroit.
Exactly. Why is that?
Because the triumphant narrative is deeply comforting. The reality of 1943 is abrasive and deeply uncomfortable.
Right.
Acknowledging the hate strikes requires admitting that the greatest generation was also wrestling with brutal, entrenched racism, and that the arsenal of democracy was constructed on a foundation of profound inequality.
It's always easier for a society to memorialize the ships it built rather than the neighborhoods it burned. But failing to confront the dark underside of the boom means failing to understand the true structural cost of the society we inherited.
Very true.
Let's trace the arc of what we've unpacked. 1943 was the year the pressure cooker of the American home front shattered.
We watched the tension break in the shipyards of Mobile, where the mere promotion of 12 black men to skilled labor sparked a massive production-halting riot.
We saw how a transient, anxious population in Beaumont, Texas, weaponized a false rumor to set a community on fire.
We examined the catastrophic collapse of infrastructure and social order in Detroit, where the fight for scarce housing and jobs ended with 34 dead in the streets of our most vital manufacturing hub.
And we dissected the Harlem uprising, where a community finally struck back against the systemic discrimination and police violence that hemmed them in.
In every instance, the underlying physics were the same. The deadly, tragic cost of an unequal society forced into close quarters.
The events of 1943 are not merely academic history. They are a structural blueprint for understanding the mechanics of our modern society.
The underlying pressures of demographic shifts, severe housing crises, and stark workplace inequalities are not relics of a bygone era.
No, they are the baseline realities of the present day. And exactly as they did in the shipyards and boomtowns of World War II, those underlying structural pressures remain highly volatile.
Ready to ignite when exposed to the accelerants of fear and misinformation.
Which leaves a lingering, unsettling thought to carry with you. We look back at the rumors that sparked the destruction of Beaumont and Detroit. The literal, physical whispers passed from person to person over a fence line.
Or on a crowded street corner.
Right. And we tend to view them as tragic artifacts of a slow, pre-digital age. But if a whispered rumor at a public park in 1943 could result in 34 deaths and require federal armored vehicles to suppress.
What happens to a highly pressured, overcrowded, anxious society today when a false rumor doesn't take days to travel across town but can reach 400,000 people in a single second?
It's the question the history demands we answer. Thank you for taking this deep dive.